Yeah, fine. Thank you. So in this talk, I'd like to present how one can identify and characterize premium sequence stars using all the beautiful survey data that has been shown earlier today by Roberto, and also the near-infrared data shown earlier on this week. So I'm Venu Kalari. I'm a staff scientist at Gemini Observatory in Chile, and which is part of the NSF's larger NR lab program. So star formation, to give a basic overview of the current paradigm, is that we think that there's a dark cloud of dust and gas, and over time this cloud collapses into a small core. This collapse is a few orders of magnitude, so any small angular momentum is amplified by the similar order, and therefore most of the mass falls in a disk, not in the central core. So over time, say a few million years, mass is transferred from the disk to the central core, and the remnants of the disk is what planets form from. And over time, once the star gains mass, it sort of goes along this track shown here. And when it gains enough mass, it can start nuclear fusion in its core. So there exists a small period of time, say a few million years, since the star has fallen into its core, that if one captures it before it falls in the main sequence, you get a snapshot of the star formation process. Now, the trouble with observing these stars stars forming are, at least in the first few stages, they're invisible in the optical and near infrared, and until very recently, one could not capture them to the same resolution and clarity as one can in the optical and near infrared. And if you capture them too late, they're already formed. You can't really study the star formation process. You can only study what's happened afterwards. But to capture these two stages, if you capture enough premium sequence stars, you can essentially study a lot of things about the star formation process itself. Firstly, you can get a snapshot of star formation. So shown here is the head chart diagram, and for low mass stars, which is what I'm talking mainly focused on here, where this picture is applicable, if you capture enough of them, say in a particular star forming region, as shown here on the right-hand side, which is a classic example, you can sort of predict what is the star formation scenario. And in this classic paper by Pala and Staller in 2001, they suggested that they studied many regions using similar sort of method, and they suggested it was accelerating star formation. So another thing that you can study by capturing these premium sequence stars are you can use them as a probe to understand premium sequence evolution itself. So in our current paradigm, it is assumed that the disk is truncated by the magnetic field before it hits the star, and mass flows along the disk to the star via the magnetic field lines. The reason I'm talking about this picture is that there's different accretion indicators. So if you can identify how much mass, what is the luminosity in excess with the accretion, either by the shock or the flow, you can sort of measure the accretion rate. And the nice thing about these young stars are they're not spread out towards the galactic plane of the galaxy. They concentrate in very young star-forming regions. They're mostly found along the galactic plane. So shown here is a picture of our galaxy, and the footprint shown here is the VFIS and IFIS surveys, and the blue dots are the star-forming regions that are accessible to those surveys. So to summarize here, well, if you capture observations of low-mass stars that are young, you can understand premium sequence evolution, star formation, and the bulk of such stars are accessible to currently available surveys in the optical narrowband or near infrared. And the first step I'm going to talk about is identifying them. So you can use accretion, as I showed before, as an indicator to identify these premium sequence stars. So in this paradigm here, that when mass is transferred along the magnetic field lines, there's hot ionized gas, and this leads to very broad emission lines. So that leads to broad H-alpha lines, which can be easily identified in relative to the stellar photosphere. So shown here is, in this diagram, I've plotted a spectrum of a premium sequence star and overlaid a different filter band passes. You can't actually see the H-alpha emission line because it's overtaken by the filter band pass. But if you have excess emission in H-alpha, you can see it. But also, there's a continuum excess when the matter falls on the stellar surface in the U band. So these two accretion indicators that you can find identify premium sequence stars, but also measure their rate of mass transfer. But also you have an additional sort of sanity check um, by looking by cross-matching with near-infrared data, where you can look at excess in the stellar excess compared to a stellar photosphere, so that you can see the circumstellar disk. So how does the data actually bleed into color diagrams is shown here. So if you have excess U-band luminosity, you can see that in, say, U minus G, G minus R color diagram. The black line shown here is the stellar photosphere, and excess stars, which are supposedly premium sequence stars, are identified with the color with the blue crosses. And the same thing goes for H alpha as well. So there's indicator for the stellar photosphere and the spectral type, which is the R minus I color, and R minus H alpha basically gives you a picture of H alpha emission line excess candidates. So with these two color diagrams, you've already identified a bulk of the premium sequence stars. But additionally, you can use a sanity check with the near infrared, where you can identify stars that are excess in disk that have excess infrared excesses in the K band because of the presence of a disk. So shown here again is the black line is the stellar photosphere, and the blue crosses are stars with excess in near infrared excess, and the red line is basically a model for different mass accretion rates. So if you feed that information along with, say, a classical color magnitude diagram where you can get the masses and ages of stars, you can combine all that information to measure the mass accretion rate, which I stress is the single most important measurable for the premium sequence stars. And not only can you get the mass accretion rate from one indicator, you can get it from two indicators, the H alpha luminosity and also the U band luminosity. And generally what we've seen even with photometry is that these indicators agree well within the errors. Not only, for an example, not only can you study premium sequence evolution here, but you can also have a snapshot of star formation. So shown on the top right, I've shown a picture of the star forming region NGC 6383, and overlaid the circles correspond to premium sequence stars identified and the color and size corresponds to age. So the bigger they are, the younger they are, and the more yellower they are, the accretion rate is higher. So the younger stars with more higher mass accretion rates are concentrated in clusters, where the older ones are more spread out. So this is indicative of how the star formation has proceeded in this region. And the important thing to stress here is that using such methods, you know your selection criteria, you know your cutoff magnitude, you know your saturation limit, you know if you have completeness issues with gaps in the CCD chips. Obviously, extinction factors into it as well, but even then, you can account for your completion limit, and you know your biases. So it's a very homogeneous and uniform study that you can perform using such data sets. And also, the gold standard in the field is still spectroscopy, but when you compare the photometric values we get, it compares quite well to spectroscopy. So shown here are shown as a function of spectral type, so effective temperature is the residuals between measured H alpha equivalent width from various studies versus the ones calculated by Gaia DR3. So the pseudo equivalent width that you multiply by some number to get a realistic value. And the values shown in gray and black are from photometry from WFIS and IFIS, and the red and the green ones are from different spectroscopic sources. I think the difference is fiber and slit spectra. So the difference is around 25 Armstrongs in scatter in H alpha equivalent width, but it's very similar for either spectroscopy or photometry. So the values you're getting for H alpha equivalent widths over a large range of studies is very similar compared to a baseline ground truth. So this is mainly to give confidence to us that the values we measure are representative to another method, seen here as spectroscopy. So moving forward, accretion as a probe to prove as a probe for premium sequence evolution. Currently, there are two competing theories on how the disks are created. So moving from the simplified view I showed earlier, the idea is that the disks either have a large region where there's not enough ionization for transferring of mass. So the idea is either in those regions there's a disk wind that is driving the accretion, but also the accretion can be viscously driven with basically MRI. So there's a beautiful study recently published which looks at the distribution of mass accretion rates from these two different competing models, and they find that the distribution is very different. Basically, for magnetically driven or the wind-driven, basically model, there's a peak at a much higher mass accretion rate, whereas for the viscous-driven, there's a much lower peak and a much longer slope. So they compared their observations with results from spectroscopy, and from the literature was around 100 stars. So it doesn't give you that much of a statistical base, but if one can try and include values from photometry, say from all the large surveys, from IFAS and VFAS, from all the studies, the increase is quite dramatic. So you have a factor of 4 or 5 increase in the statistics in the mass accretion rate. So photometric surveys, even though they might not be as precise as spectroscopy, they are an extremely useful tool to discriminate theory, especially in prime sequence evolution. And not only in that, as I said before, they can also be a snapshot of star formation. So here, for example, I show a picture of Trifid Nebula. So in this region, it was predicted that there were two clouds colliding, which is shown by the blue and the red contours in the left-hand side diagram. And the clouds are moving at different velocities. They've collided, they've created a cavity in the middle, and the star formation is happening all around it. That was a prediction from observations in the radio. But when I looked at observations using the same method where we identify prime sequence stars, you saw that there's no prime sequence stars right in the center, and the ages of the stars on two different sides of the clouds are very similar, and this is smaller than the crossing time, which basically suggests that there could have been cloud-cloud collision-induced star formation. And you can see that even in the accretion rate diagram picture, where the purpler, the dark color of the prime sequence star, the more higher is the mass accretion rate, and the stars with the highest accretion rates are the edges of the cloud where they should be denser and the star formation is immediately triggered. And there's probably older stars spread out throughout the cloud, which are lower mass accretion rate. The issue now facing such studies is that, as was pointed out in the previous talk very nicely, is that currently observations are of two flavors: young nearby star-forming regions or unique individual objects. But to really more systematically categorize regions, you need to probe further. Why? Because currently, so shown here is a diagram of galactocentric radius versus the star formation rate. So the red line basically shows where the bulk of current literature studies look at. And it's not very representative of the star formation within our galaxy itself. The potential with all the new surveys and with more recent works is shown by the red dotted line. This is where current surveys can reach to the depth in the optical and infrared. And so there's a potential to expand the galactic view. And this is not only important because you sample more of the galaxy, which is representative star formation throughout the galaxy, but also that accretion itself can be different. So the environment can greatly affect the accretion process. So shown on the right is shown on the left is the fraction of stars with disks in different clusters as a function of age, and the blue line shows clusters closer to our galaxy, and the black line shows more massive star-forming regions with a lot more ionizing stars. So in these star regions, the disk fraction is lower, and it's thought that the disks themselves are affected by the ionizing stars photoevaporating them. But there's also a more interesting study where there was suggested that there are more masses, there's more mass in planets than there are then there's mass measured in disk. So the idea is there's an insufficient disk mass as measured currently to form the planets that we see. So the idea is that maybe the planets are formed very early on before the disk mass has been measured, or that sort of disks act as conveyor belts where they gather mass from the environment and sort of help to form the planet. So it's very important to study the environmental effects to understand processes like these. So basically, in summary, that we need to expand on the studies of premium sequence stars to truly take advantage of such large surveys to look into regions with higher stellar densities and higher ionizing stars. And there are many open questions related to this, not just mentioned in this talk, but also mentioned in decadal surveys. I've highlighted some here and highlighted how important it is to conduct such surveys. So, and the important thing is such data sets are already in hand. Basically, the VFIS-IFIS surveys and the TUMAS Spitzer surveys and also other near-infrared surveys. So there is a great need to conduct such a study soon. So in summary of my talk, basically one can identify creating premium sequence stars in star-forming regions using current optical infrared wide field surveys, and they provide very homogeneous accretion rates that can help constrain theory and also give a snapshot of star formation. Yeah, thank you.